Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another Product People community event. If it's your first time joining us, welcome. We're very happy to have you here with us. And if you're here for the second or the third or the how manyth time, welcome again. We're very happy to have you back. So today we're going to talk about product growth, mature organizations versus startups. And we're really excited because Loretta Eidam from Personio is going to be talking to us about this today. She's the head of a lot of things. It's product design and engineering ops. So that's really cool. I don't know how someone does all of that, but she can, and she's going to be talking to us tonight. So I hope you're all as excited as I am. Just to tell you a little bit about myself before we kick off. So my name is Stefan. As you can see, I am in Cape Town in South Africa. Hence the accent, I think, if you can hear them. For me, it doesn't sound like an accent, but for other people, it might. So I've been working with product people now for about 6-7 months now, and I've been in product management for a while. Worked in the bank and in lots of different other companies after that as well, through product people. So it's been a really cool experience. And I started off as an attorney and then moved over to product management in my career. So that's just a little bit about me. And then a little bit more about product people. So one of our big loves is what we're doing tonight, and that's sharing knowledge generously within the product community. And you being in this call means that you're part of that product management community. So thank you for being part of it. And then our other love is the actual doing the work of product managers, onboarding fast, aligning teams and delivering outcomes and helping teams to deliver and discover great products faster. We work on an interim basis for lots of different companies as product managers, product ops, or product leaders. And we usually like to do that with 3 or more months for these companies. So before we jump into handing over to Loretta, we wanted to ask you 2 questions as a bit of an icebreaker. And you'll see if you're on Zoom, there's going to pop up a poll with these 2 questions which you can answer. And if you're on any of the other channels that we're streaming to, like Facebook or LinkedIn, you can also just comment on your chats there. So the first question is, would you rather work in a startup or a long-standing organization? And then the options are startup or long-standing organization. And then the second question is, which is more challenging, driving product transformation in a startup or a long-standing organization? And then again, you have your 2 options, startup or long-standing organization. So for me, as someone, a few months ago, beginning of the year, I was still working for like a 40,000 plus organization, which has been around for, I think, 80 years, and then did the transition over to more of a startup type of world. It's been really crazy, but very interesting and very energizing as well. But there's pros and cons to both. So I'm looking forward to seeing what your answers would be for this. I see we are getting some people who are saying they'd rather work in a long-standing organization. On YouTube, they're saying that. And let's see what our Zoom people are saying. So about 75% of the people on Zoom are saying that they'd rather work in a startup organization, and 25% of people said that they'd rather work in a long-standing organization. And then, which is more challenging, driving product transformation in a startup or a long-standing organization? So there, on the Zoom channel, what we've seen is that about 67% of people have said that it's more difficult in a long-standing organization, which I kind of have to agree with myself. But we'll see what Loretta maybe says, and maybe she has some other insights for us. And with that, thanks everyone for contributing. I'm going to hand over to Loretta. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Stefan. By the way, a lot of people think the African accent sounds a bit like Australian, so that's actually what I would have guessed.
Oh, really?
Nice. Cool. So let me share my screen, everybody. And thank you for participating in the poll. Always interesting to see the different perspectives. So what I'm going to do today is take you through my experiences driving change for product, both in long-standing orgs versus startups. Now, when I first wrote this, I wrote mature orgs versus startups. And then I very quickly realized that an organization can be around for a long time and not really be mature. So I decided to make it a little bit more factually accurate. I've been working for almost 2 decades, likely older than most people on this call. I've come to terms with that. That's fine. And really hope today to share with you some of my experiences that you could find helpful. A little bit of a disclaimer. I don't think everything that I say will be, completely groundbreaking, just, modest side of me. But hopefully for those of you who've already heard it or experienced it yourself, that I can help validate or refresh some of those lessons that you may have had. Nice. So a little bit about me. I've lived a pretty global life. So I was born in Hong Kong and moved to Australia when I was really young, 5. And since that time, I've worked in Australia. I've had teams in India. I've lived in Singapore, Hong Kong. I now live in the UK, but working with a team that's very predominantly European based, which is very exciting to say the least. My experiences have really helped me be very open-minded, which I think is really key in product, and certainly has helped me embrace change in a different way, and also, have empathy for a lot of different team members who come from different backgrounds. So, a topic I won't cover today, but that's really interesting to me, is how we actually, value and leverage diversity in product. But that would be another show. Cool. So in my time, in a very similar theme as working in a lot of different countries, I've also worked in a lot of actually interrelated disciplines. Getting a bit tongue-tied there, getting a bit, no, not nervous. Working in different disciplines, which funnily enough really set me up to be a great person to work in a startup environment just because of that generalist skill set. So you can see that I've driven transformation. So what does that mean? So designing an org, right? So if you think about being a startup, designing an org, those skills are very, very helpful. Process improvement, Stefan, I realize that both you and I have Lean Six Sigma on our toolkit. I've done portfolio management, so understanding how to balance the different investments that a company may make, to grow their product or customer base or reduce costs. I've led a design team, worked as a product director, and now here I am in PDE Ops. I probably need as many hands as, young Benedict there, because it's a lot of maneuvering. And then, as I was putting together this presentation, I realized that despite working across all those disciplines and having spent time in design, I still make really ugly slide decks. Definitely not AAA definition, so luckily it's annotated by my voice. Nice, moving on. So into the ugly deck, function over form. As with any problem solving, we need to first understand what is it that we're looking at. And so, I want to show you and take you through the definitions, and I'd love to hear your comments as we go through any questions you may have towards the end. So look, long-standing organizations, so may or may not actually be mature. I think the oldest org I ever worked for was 150 years old, not being competitive, Stefan. But if you think about that and the evolution of such an organization, it has gone through so much change, not just within the org to optimize, but actually together with the times. If I think about the very start of my career, the biggest, priority at that point was actually getting online, right? So, I actually started in the paper ages. That's right, in the paper ages. And, the ways of working are typically really well established and really, really stable, but essentially it means it's really entrenched. So for those of you who answered that long-standing orgs is more difficult to drive change, these are some of the hurdles that you can actually face, right? You've got loyal employees who've been working there for a long time, working in the same way, in a very stable way. Things work pretty well, you get rid of inefficiency that's well structured. What you see is what you get. I remember, when I moved into even just Standard Chartered, that's based in Singapore, which is, one of the head offices. I found it astounding. I couldn't order, project management software to be deployed to my laptop, which in the past I could have done with ANZ, which is a bank I worked with in Australia. So in general, things work pretty well. But, as I go through this, I can tell you one of the biggest downsides of stability is actually a complacency of the org, because there's not a huge motivation to change things. It's working well enough. And typically the competition is pretty set. You've grown your customer base. So unless you're at risk of, mass attrition or, fearing that, someone's going to disrupt your industry, the incentive to change is pretty low. And on top of that, like the appetite for risk in different industries, will vary. But in these long-standing organizations that have been around for so long, the risk appetite typically is quite low. Cool. Let's look at startups. I think most people on the call would have quite a bit of experience in this, and there shouldn't be anything surprising. It is fast-paced, to put it very, very lightly. Recently went on annual leave for 2 weeks and came back, and then places are different. And then I put with caveat here, and what do I mean by that? It's fast-paced in how quickly we need to change. It's fast-paced in terms of the ambition and speed we need to move at, but it can actually be quite slow. And I'll come to that in a few slides. Very dynamic. So, a person could be fulfilling the same role, multiple roles, right? So they come in maybe as a lawyer and end up a designer and a product manager. But no, really, we see people fulfilling multiple roles just because they've learned so many things and have so many things in their toolkit, and it really fills in a dire need, especially if I think about the hiring practices in an area like Germany, which has really long notice periods. So you get a massive advantage with people who's got that generalist background. I was one of those people, who really brought in like a toolkit, which, from org design to setting up teams to HR, jack of all trades, I like to humbly say about myself. So you've really got that dynamic nature. Constant change, I mentioned, and this is where we slow down. When a startup is quite small, I think most of you know that, it's really easy to have very democratic decision making. So what does that mean? Every person and their dog is probably involved in every discussion, regardless of role, sometimes regardless of function. And that works really well on a small scale. But as you hyper grow and hyper scale, that decision-making process is really going to slow you down. The relevance of the information, how people might feel, right? If they actually don't get the decision in the direction that they want, that all actually leads to things getting pretty unsticky, which means that, decisions are made and then they're kind of rolled back, or, it takes a lot longer to make those decisions. So even though a startup is really fast-paced, that sort of, way of working can actually then, scale you back or bring you back. And then my personal thing that I found when going into a startup environment, so I've got two under my belt, is that you can't assume any knowledge. So there are things that I, would assume to know. So if I said to all of you, what color is an orange? Most people will like, it's orange. But in a startup, I've learned that you cannot do that. You've got people from all walks of life, very different backgrounds, organizations that are structured differently, have worked differently. And there are nuances in that knowledge, which means that you really need to invest that time to ensure everybody's on the same page, really talking about the same thing before you deep dive. And that's the environment that I have found in a startup. Right, so now we know what I mean in the title when I say long-standing organization, and you know what I mean by startup. Now let's talk about what I mean by growth. Now, we're not here today to talk about how to structure your product roadmap, based on different stages of growth. Product people can invite me back if you want that. But today I'm really focusing on, how you're actually growing the product discipline, right? Either in size or the scope of the product. It could be growing that particular team. You could be changing your model. You could be, like I mentioned, being disrupted, right? So if I was, working in the hotel industry and I see Airbnb, you probably get, a bunch of people together to say, okay, we're going to get disrupted. What do we do? Same with taxis, although they probably didn't do that. And then, from a long-standing or mature org perspective, a lot of the work is actually structured differently. So if I think about a really old, been around a long time org, a lot in production, a big customer base, a big percentage of your effort goes into maintaining that product or, run the product. Whereas if I look at, in a startup environment, it's build, and build, and build even faster. And so, you've got growth that is kind of working in both ways. And so you want to ensure that if you are in a long standing, that you actually account for things that are also around cost cutting, because, cost cutting, revenue generation maximizes the profit for the company. So that's what I mean by growth. Cool. So let's talk about what this actually means when you're doing this at a mature org. Long-standing became too long to say. I mentioned earlier, people are genuinely really risk averse. I've been in situations where we're trying to make a decision on whether or not we pursue a product, and a product that seems really good on paper. So the one that I'll tell you about is back in 2015, I was with a bank in Australia. And at that time, I was leading a digitization roadmap. So executing on the digital building blocks that we needed to get our business transformed in a more, digital native, way. And through that, we were looking at bringing in, optical character recognition, image scanning, just to digitize and get off paper. And I identified you can actually open a bank account on your mobile. It does not sound special now, because, everyone's worked with N26 or Monzo and Revolut, everyone's doing it these days, but this is 2015. And it seemed like a great idea. You could essentially, we had a business case that said you're going to cut down on people costs because, you don't need people filling in these forms and helping people through the process. It meant that you could reach a much larger audience. You can tap into, born digital people. And it was just, innovative and cool and snazzy. The review and approval process went on for months. It actually kept going, even when I moved countries. And I think, when I joined Personio, I tried to tap into my old network to see if anybody was keen to explore opportunities in Europe with product. And my colleague very excitedly said to me, "Hey, that thing that you were working on, they finally went live." That was in 2021. So that was a 6-year gap, all due to, of course, there's challenges such as feasibility and getting things into production and changes and blah. So it's not a criticism at all. But, what I'm trying to, I guess, highlight to you and this group is that, relative to a startup, in a mature org, things can move, much more slowly. Inertia is a very real thing. Inertia is actually based on a few things. So number one is the level of competition that you actually have, right? So, it's a, eat or be eaten situation. You're going to be wanting to move pretty quickly because you have no choice. In absence of that, there's no forcing function. And you actually see quite a bit of silos as well. So if you think about from a product perspective, the way that we structured really effectively at Mox was actually looking at the different missions that we wanted to achieve, right? But if I think about as you get into a bigger and bigger product team, so within Personio, and my numbers could be wrong now because we grow so quickly, something about 450 in product design and engineering. Maybe even bigger now by the time I say this sentence. I think every month we have roughly about 80 to 100 people onboarding across the entire org, and we've got very ambitious growth targets. And when you look at scaling a team or an org, what you actually start seeing happen is the considerations for how you actually structure in the most effective way. And so you see a separation, even a mature org, we see this a lot, where you've got the business as usual teams. Right? And then innovation teams, right? But you're actually working on the same product, right? So it creates these silos, which doesn't really work that well at all. And you end up with a really clunky, disjointed process, a disjointed experience, which ultimately for the customer doesn't make a lot of sense. So, things may make sense from a structural perspective, and it may actually work really well, but ultimately we are providing one product and one experience, and silos do not help that. And when we're looking at transforming in a mature org, very often the siloed teams start coming up because, well, it's too hard to change people's ways of working. It's too hard to get rid of that risk-averse mindset. It's too hard to pull people out of the work they're actually working on. And the skill set is so different. And so a lot of the times, people defer to setting up, dedicated teams to look at the innovation. I can't speak for all companies. I think, there must be places out there where this works really, really well. But for myself, I've certainly seen the pains of this, because you need to find a way to integrate back together, after you have all these different teams, and that causes, some longer term pains. And then lastly, there's talent scarcity. I think, with startups, even though it still is hard to find talent, often, larger organizations tend to want to move people around internally. And because of that, you may be restricted, to certain talent pools before you actually hire external. A lot of that is related to cost management, right? In fact, one of my, core principles is to be resourceful. So it's actually really good to make use of the resources that you've got, grow and develop your people. But unless you've actually had that developmental pathway and supported them in that growth, then you're going to have a pretty small pool until you've addressed that gap. Growing product at a startup. Oh, I have seen this. It all starts really good. Everyone's like, this is the best time. You're energized, you're engaged, you're excited. You've just joined a mission you can stand behind. There is free beer at the taps I've worked at. I'm still at a WeWork now. And the first time I saw that stuff, I was like, oh my gosh, I feel so inspired. everyone is just, happy days. Then you actually start, feeling the pressure, right? So you've done the research, you've had the discovery, you've got a pretty good idea now, and now it's time to actually click, slam on the go button. And people start thinking, okay, well, we're all starting to be a little bit different now. Okay, some things are causing us to lose that or evolve from like this hyper energy that we did have when we came together. And then invariably what happens is frameworks come in, governance comes in, measurements come in, and then you start seeing this debate, is this actually killing innovation? If we're doing quarterly planning, is this waterfall and not agile? Right? So there's all this kind of like ideological philosophies being questioned because, you're bringing in the governance, the frameworks and measurements, the standardization. I think I had almost a philosophical debate one time thinking, should we make everyone do sprints, start and finish the same across the board? Feel free to drop your 2 cents in the chat, because there's a benefit to doing that, but of course it does mean that people don't have that autonomy anymore. And so one of the biggest questions I've found as we expand on product and design is how much standardization do we actually want, right? And then how much do we actually keep flexible so that people actually still feel inspired and innovative and not locked in? Because the reasons why people join a startup, the things that attract them to a startup, probably is not going to be the same as, where things need to be as a company grows and grows and grows. And then, of course, then you get people reminiscing, things were so much better at the start and now there's more work. And then I think the other thing with startups, that I've found very unique is that there's almost like an expectation that people don't run out of steam, because the better you do, the more you need to do, and the more that people actually want from you, right? And so in absence of having that right infrastructure and support, it can be really hard on people, and that's something that we really need to be cognizant of. Cool. So looking at that, I just want everyone to have a quick think about, well, out of what I have described, which is actually more challenging? I know we don't have a poll, but feel free to drop your answers in chat or just keep the answer to yourself until we go into Q&A. But let's come back to that initial poll that we had, right? So where would you rather work, in a startup or a long-standing organization? And then the second piece is, well, in fact, which is more challenging? Okay, hold that thought. All right, so let's talk about the common challenges. So despite describing 2 very different landscapes, there's actually a lot of commonality in transforming. You can see I've actually changed the wording from growth to transformation just to align across the 2 situations. But whether you're growing a product team or you're, trying to get better, it is a transformation. You're going from, A to B, a mouse to an elephant, to whatever it is. Things are changing really rapidly. And it's really hard. Change management is, from my experience, commonly misunderstood. When we think about change, we think a lot about the emotional side of change, which is very, very important. I don't know if anyone on the call has read Switch, which is a book on change management or driving successful change. And there's a methodology, a metaphor in there that has really, really stuck with me. And it talks about the elephant and the rider. So the elephant, lots of elephants references today, the elephant represents the emotional side, right? So, this is the bit that feels like they want the change, right? This is the part you have to convince the people to feel like they want it. The rider is the rational side. This is the bit where, once you've actually convinced the person that change is good and necessary, although it may be hard, we need to make it easy for people to adopt that change. Now, there's a very, real reason why it's like the elephant and the rider and not the other way around, is because ultimately, if the 2 are misaligned, typically the elephant will win out. We all like to think we're very logical, rational people, and we are, but emotions actually play a much bigger part, right, than we actually think. And so in driving that change across the org, really need to have that empathy and understanding what people are actually going through, to be able to maneuver them and help them and guide them through the change. You're definitely, trying to, design and build the plane whilst trying to move at the same time. In either case, it's true. Whether you're keeping the lights on or actually trying to deliver a very ambitious roadmap, you're actually figuring out the ways of working all the way through. And it is actually really slow. So whilst you've got the overdone governance that I mentioned, at a long-standing org where you go through investment case and numbers and budgeting and then budgeting again and then feasibility and all the rest of that, which takes a long time, the non-sticky decisions can actually be really damaging as well, because it means that people can't trust on stability. And so, when you're going into a discussion and proposing your argument, people don't feel so inclined to want to speak up and say those things, to propose these, amazing product ideas or ways of working, because, well, is it really going to stick? Like, are people actually going to listen? And that can actually be really damaging over time. So for me personally, it's actually easier to fix the overdone governance, because it's just a matter of finding like the right level of risk acceptance. But non-sticky decisions is actually really damaging to the culture, because people then stop buying into, how we're actually making those decisions or actually, moving further along. And then I actually find in startups, there's a lower tolerance. Not sure if it's because I actually don't have a good hypothesis, or, maybe one for individual one-on-one, but I think the tolerance for that change, especially at such a rapid pace, can be pretty low. People typically very quickly start comparing it to, the golden experience that they've had or how things were done in the last startup. And so you kind of get all this, arguments around, well, when I was here, it was done like this. And that way is right. It worked really well. But everyone needs to recognize, examples or experiences are always helpful for us to think about, especially in a product context. But it's not the way to actually think about what you should do moving forward. It actually has, not a lot to do with it. And so, that's something also to watch out for. So the reason why I've talked about culture is that fundamentally working in product is a very ambiguous role. Now, why is that? Typically, you're dealing with something that's pretty new. If you're lucky, if you've worked with companies that are creating a new category, a new product, serving a new market segment, there's no blueprint. There's nothing you can Google or look up. When I took on product operations, first thing I did was go to Amazon and went, where are the books? No books. There were articles everywhere, and then of course, people had opinions, but there's no reference. And building a product is exactly like that. You really have to deal with things that are unknown, right? And so, one of the key things that I always highlight with my team is that we need to have comfort with ambiguity. Now, that doesn't mean that we just go ahead, let's be cowboys or cowgirls, cow people, charge ahead despite unknowns. That's called irresponsible, right? Because essentially we're not balancing the risk, the impact. Time, resources are two things that you can never have enough of. And so you want to move in a very effective way. And part of that means that you've got to be comfortable doing enough with the unknown, but then actually find ways to bring down that ambiguity so that you've got more certainty. You then also want to look at balancing that across your portfolio, because if you're looking at a whole product suite of ideas, a whole product roadmap, you may look at that and say, actually, I'm happy with this percentage being pretty ambiguous because I've got this percentage that I've got high confidence on. It may not be as rewarding, but this is going to be my high risk, high reward area, right? So it's really balancing that across the entire product portfolio, whilst using the right research and experimentation methodology to actually then reduce that ambiguity, feeding that back into your product planning processes so you can get the best outcome. Now, why did I say this is actually interrelated with culture, is ultimately building a psychologically safe environment where people can actually feel like they can experiment, can make mistakes, have the guardrails, and actually be able to learn from those. I don't even want to call them mistakes, but to learn from where things have not worked. That is actually fundamentally how we want our product managers to be able to think. And unless we've actually got that culture where people feel safe to do that, well, it's going to be a pretty big challenge. We can't on the one hand be like, feel free to make mistakes or, trial and error, etc. But then on the other hand, we then say, but for your performance report, you made 3 experiments that were, flawed, etc. Right? So I think, it really comes down to the leaders to be able to understand, what is the general environment? What is the normal mode of working, right? The way that we actually, handle experimentation, which allows product managers to actually thrive at their best. And then finally, you really need that empathy. I think goes without saying, People talk about compassion instead of empathy, but I think empathy is really important in a product perspective because you need to understand your users. So all of this together actually helps to address some of the earlier challenges that are highlighted. So, difficulty to drive change, right? So being able to trial and error, knowing when to stop, having that empathy so you can actually help guide that elephant, right? All of these things will actually help you combat growth or transformation challenges in your startup or long-standing org. So just a little bit of visual now. So, from an emotional perspective, whichever environment you're in, having a growth mindset will always put you in good stead. A lot of people think about growth mindset and, we talk about the benefits. Look at the crafty expression on that elephant's face. Check out its eye. Looks a bit dodgy. Right. So growth mindset, it's really about saying it's not about saying I'm comfortable with having gaps. It's actually saying things are going to change in different environments and different settings. And I will not always have the right answers, but I believe that I can, right? That I believe by putting in the right work, having, confidence, being structured, experimenting, etc., I can actually then, overcome any gaps that I may have. Being able to embrace change. So how do you, foster that in your people, right? You can't say overnight, you like change. People once compared change to actually being worse than death because we are creatures of habit, right? So you need to be able to sway people. So when you've got like a fantastic product idea, so for example, like the phone onboarding, we also had looked at building a gamified savings proposition, right, in Mox, which is where I worked. And most people really didn't like that. They didn't even like the fact at first from the research that we wanted to automate how you pull in money, right? So we actually found that, people felt much more safe if they actually went to their own bank and transferred money in rather than pulling the money, right? So that change management, getting people to embrace those changes, it is a journey and it doesn't happen overnight. Having those broad perspectives is important. And I think, I talk a lot about resilience. Whenever people ask me, what do you look for in a team member? I say, there are so many transferable skills, but there are two things that never go wrong, and that's resilience and resourcefulness. And that is why I've put trust, second last, but I'm going to talk about that last. But most recently, I think, in an ambiguous environment, you're going to have people that's going to need to lead you without knowing all of the answers, being able to give you all of the rationale, being able to convince you, right? But, if you actually build that trust, that's actually going to go a long way. I think I'm running. Am I doing okay for time? Give me a thumbs up, thumbs down.
Yeah, you're still doing good.
Okay, cool. Right, and then on the other side, the rational side, you will be faced with tough decisions, right? So should you sunset a product? Should you keep going if all of the KPIs are, not trending in the direction that you want? Either you're able to do something about it or you're not, right? And you need to make that decision really, really quickly. So again, whether it comes to a mature org or, a startup, you've got to do those things very quickly. I talked about having the emotional, and this is the logical. I always break the rational into, people, process, technology. And so, the process of being able to give feedback very, very quickly, having, robust change management framework, all of the leaders would really benefit from understanding how to manage change effectively, right? Because it means that it's a multiply effect that supports their team. And then lastly, actually having that ecosystem. So a connected system, right? So things can be all in separate places. So think about when you deal with Jira versus Confluence, you've got things in Figma or Sketch, which is what I used to use. I used InVision and also Zeppelin. Everything is disconnected. Things are, scattered everywhere. I've got data coming through from GTM, data coming through from, CX. I've got data coming through from research, etc. How do you actually connect all of that so you actually understand the triangulated data to support your decision making, when you're making a product decision or figuring out how to prioritize? And one last thing is earlier on, I talked about how a lot of mature org was about, business as usual, which was maintenance. In a startup, as you're growing that product team, you start to move from that build, and actually factoring in things such as your operational metrics, right? Do you want to take a bet on whether you should build this new feature, which you think is going to get you more customers, Or do you repair something that may actually lead to reputational damage, right? So these are the decisions that, product managers need to end up making as they move from like the different journey of the beginning of the startup and as they get more and more of their product into production. And then ultimately, sorry for the cheesiness, I have a dream. If you have a dream, but you can't execute on it, it is a fantasy, right? So, we talk a lot about product strategy, growing the team, and there's all these things that you can do, but if you don't have effective ways of making that tangible, then, it's just a dream. Okay, so that is actually the end of my presentation. I think I might be bang on time, or hopefully bang on time. And then I just want to leave with you to see if anyone has changed their mind after the presentation compared to at the start on where you would rather work and what you would rather do. Thank you. I'll stop share now.
Thanks, Loretta. That was great. Especially when you, for me personally, when you talked about like all the things that you worked on in the bank and all those things, it sounded very, very familiar to me because that's where I was also a few months ago. But yeah, if you wanted to find Loretta on LinkedIn, you want to follow her, see whatever she posts there. So that's how you spell her name. And that's actually how you spell her surname. I say Eidam. That's how Loretta helped me to say it correctly. So you might have spelled it incorrectly. And you see that she's working for Personio. And I actually was working with a client before where we did a lot of interviews, like which human capital management system do we want to go with? And all of them were like, we use Personio for everything. We use Personio for everything, like with all the jobs to be done that we tried to discuss there. So I think you have a really good name out there. So it was really cool to hear your insights into all of these topics. So what we're going to do now is a Q&A is going to start. So you can start thinking about the questions that you have for Loretta, and you can start posting them on whatever channel you're on. If you're on Zoom, we'll also give you an opportunity where you can like put your hand up, unmute yourself, and ask a question to Loretta, and she can answer them. But to give you some time to formulate these questions in your head, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about product people, just to give you some time. So when is the best time for product people to come into your organization and come and help out as product managers? So on an interim product manager basis, so when you have a permanent position that you like to cover, but you know that it takes a bit long to get these people onboarded or get the right talent sourced from outside, or when you have someone that is there full-time, that they're going on a parental leave, for example, between 3 to 12 months, when you need a product coach or consultant, when you need a product discovery lead. And then here at the bottom, we have some of the clients that we have helped before. But then if we jump into a little bit more, the B2C clients that we've worked with, that we've been really very excited to work with, and the B2B clients that we've worked with so far, that's also been really awesome for us to be working on. And then here you can also see some of the positive feedbacks that we've gotten from our clients, like super fast onboarding and quickly understanding the situation and the flexibility that we've built in. So I'm not going to read all of this, but it's nice to brag a little. So just looking at product people stats, so we have 71% client retention. We have 40 product leaders and product managers that are in our organization. And a really cool stat that I'm personally very proud of is 56% of the team are women and 66% of the leadership is also women. So that's a really cool stat to be able to brag about. And this is our team. So you can see we're scattered all over. We're all different, very diverse team. And there's a placeholder there at the bottom for your picture if you wanted to join product people. So we are hiring product managers and senior product managers. So if you wanted to send through your application, then you can follow this link. So it's boards.eu.greenhouse.io and /product people. And that's it. I thought it would be a little fast. So I'm going to read some of the questions that we've gotten. So I have a question from Alvaro from LinkedIn. He said, hi, how would you align the company when you have multiple products and different end users?
Hi, Alvaro, and thank you for the question. Something we deal with every day. So if I'm hearing the question correctly, you want to understand that given we've got such a large product set and so many different customers, how do we actually align across all the different departments? So sorry for the cheesy quote again. Very recently, actually, I stood on stage at Personio at a presentation, and I said, "It takes a village to raise a baby, and it takes a company to launch a product." Now, what do I mean by that? Product just simply cannot work in isolation. So if we think about what we actually want to build on the roadmap, to even think about that roadmap requires input from our other teams. So if I think about the rich data actually coming through from people who are at the forefront, speaking to customers who decide to join Personio or decide it's not the right choice, there's a lot of analysis there that actually helps us understand the customer's needs. Now, of course, that's a smaller data set, so the sample size is not the same as if we went wide with quantitative. But in a B2B environment, it's not so easy to get that, massive B2C, customer base that you would get, because you really want people that's got, specialized experience and really using products like this. So our go-to-market teams and also our customer experience teams actually having these conversations with, either leads or actual customers on a day-to-day basis. And so, to even create that roadmap, getting those inputs from those teams, synthesizing that within the context of our roadmap and what we actually want to do, that helps already align the expectations for what we are building, right? So that's the first piece. So that's the pre-build, pre-development part. As we actually start developing, for those of you who've worked in these teams or even observed it, that when we release a product, it's really not just about pushing something out into production. We've had situations in multiple teams I've worked in, multiple companies I've worked in, where the excitement of launching something meant that each team was working in a silo. So you actually need to have, number one, the alignment on ensuring that the downstream teams are appropriately aligned and ready to support, right? So if you think about, they're great. You want your user education, you want your community content updated, you want the ability for, customers to have their queries answered if they're called. All of that takes coordination, right? So you need to agree up front what that capacity is actually going to look like so that those teams are adequately staffed and actually have, relevant warning before they get, stuck in these processes. And of course, if we think about wanting to sell that product as well, we certainly want to engage with our go-to-market team and our sales teams to make sure that what we're building in, the geography that we're pushing into, that we're aligned with them. So these are the needs of alignment that I've talked about. How you actually do it is always a great question. We use a combination of methods, and in reality, it's always a continuous improvement situation. We are trying to trim down on the efforts and the timing that we actually need to put into planning. And so, we have a dedicated group sitting in different departments, which look at, the biggest times during the year when we need to do our planning. So for example, quarterly or half yearly planning, and we actually get together ahead of time to say, what is the right sequence of this process? And then what is the ongoing day-to-day management that we actually need, so that even though we've aligned on the roadmap, we don't lose that sight and cooperation as things shift and change, which they should and do, that we continue to have up-to-date information, feeding back and forth. So that feedback loop is not just about, hey, this is the data we want to share with you, but it's also telling those people, exactly what it is that we decide to do, how that impacts them, and then lastly, ensuring that we're very courteous and up to date with any changes that we may have. Did that answer your question?
I hope it did, Loretta. I haven't seen another update from him yet, but I think it was a very good answer. So thank you for that. I also have a question. So you've spoken about the fact that what you look for is like resilience and resourcefulness, but you've also said that there's different things to think of as a product manager as you go like through the different stages of the company. So do you think there's he responded now and said yes, it did answer his question, so great. But do you think there's like the biggest skill that's different between a product manager as you go through these stages or as you work for these different companies? So is it more important for a product manager to have skill A in a startup than skill A in a long-standing organization?
That's a really good one. I can think of things maybe not even unique to product managers. As I speak, I'll try and think of anything unique to product manager. Maybe I just start with thinking what I think is important. I look for product managers or product people or product ops, any kind of like in a discipline working with product. You've got to be inquisitive. right? So if I see people drawing like really quick conclusions from seeing a small sample size of data, which is not statistically significant, that's going to be really difficult, right? So in the beginning, you want the product managers to be inquisitive, to ask the right questions, to probe, to question, to challenge. I think as you get into more and more senior roles, that really evolves into how you interpret data. So less on asking questions, but really understanding, based on the limited data set, what are the questions that are still open, and what are the things that you can actually move on with, without that full picture. So I think the ability to deal with ambiguity kind of like overlaps with that inquisitive nature. So I think most people would then need to look at how they transition into that, but not lose some of the kind of the great curiosity, which makes a great product person. That's one. Yeah, I think that's the one that comes front of mind. But if I think of anything else, I'll make sure I add that to the comments.
Okay, thank you, Loretta. And then I also had another question. So you were talking about the balance of ambiguity and certainty. And do you think if we look at it at a bar chart and we see like the levels here and the levels here, do you think that changes between a startup through to a long-standing organization? Do you think like ambiguity gets to be successful, it's okay if it's less or more as it changes through the organization?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Things within an org and thinking about building a product, you also then have to align with other teams that are dealing with ambiguity, right? So I think that ambiguity in a startup is definitely much higher. And again, you also don't want to just, do a blueprint and copy what something, someone else has done. You want to design and customize something that really works for that particular situation. I don't think you've got that, constant change and constant need to answer questions and figure things out when you're in a mature org, mainly because the state of things is just pretty set. And it also means that, even a long-standing organization, it's likely that the industry you've been in, right, has also been around for a long time. So you've actually got lots of competitors, the amount of research and data and reporting and consultants, right, that people have to address ambiguity, I think is very different story from in a startup where you don't necessarily have those answers either externally or internally. But then the biggest difference is, even if everything is set in terms of how a product should be, when your environment changes, you're then thrown into the same loop, right? So let's take COVID as an example. Lots of doctors, lots of nurses, scientists, etc., lots of knowledge, right? But then you can get thrown into a situation where something brand new comes up, right? And then, you really still have to deal with that ambiguity. But I think the frequency would be very different, right? So for those kind of like really big events, versus, a day-to-day working in an ambiguous environment, I think startups definitely has a lot more.
Okay, thank you, Loretta. And I also got a question here that I'm not sure where it came from, but Dila sent it to me directly. So the question is, what would be the best way to negotiate our way of prioritizing new features in long-standing organizations, especially when the important stakeholders demand something other than what your team prioritizes?
Nice. I think if we're already thinking about stakeholders, we're not in the best place, because it tells me you've got stakeholders, telling maybe this product team what to do, and then you're actually not leveraging the beauty of having a product manager. I think ultimately the best thing to do is all about the science and the data of it. When you prioritize, I think it's also responsibility to have that strong reason and strong rationale and to back it up with the right data. Typically, people are more convinced by things that they can see and touch. So tools that I've used in the past, even if I just drew it, with a Sharpie on paper, the visualization really helps you negotiate and help people see the value of what things can be. And then I'm also a big fan of user research. It really depends on the stakeholders that you're working with. I've also had stakeholders or, senior executives, very intelligent people, really question the value of user research. I think if people went on mute, I might hear an audible gasp on that piece. So, it really depends on the person that you're working with. And finally, it doesn't hurt to understand what's really important to that particular person that you're answering to. And so, if it's a matter of creating something that's still going to achieve the goal, it may not just be the thing that they're thinking of, but highlighting how this is actually going to get them much closer versus the thing they wanted you to prioritize first, is going to go a long way, because it demonstrates you understand their priorities.
Yeah, I agree. And what I've also seen myself, what I've had to learn the hard way is that you need to know your audience when you're trying to, get what you want. Is like if someone is super duper on the data, make sure you have the data there. If someone is super duper on the UX research and stuff, make sure you have that there and, knowing your audience when you want to discuss these things.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't think we have any other questions, and we are already like a minute or so over time. So I think we're going to stop the Q&A here. But I just wanted to say thank you so much, Loretta. I think all of us have really enjoyed your talk and your presentation and the really great answers that you've given us, and it was really insightful. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much. It was an absolute pleasure being with all of you.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining, and we'll see you next week.